She pulled me close, and in that fragile silence, I realized some embraces aren't about love, they're about not breaking. It started on one of those evenings that felt heavier than usual, the kind where the air itself seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. The sun had already begun to sink behind the old brick buildings, casting long shadows through the narrow streets. I remember the way the golden light hit her hair when I first saw her standing by the edge of the park, a quiet figure, almost lost in her own thoughts. She was 40, maybe a little older, with that kind of presence that doesn't shout for attention but quietly commands it. Her long black hair framed her face perfectly, falling in soft waves that caught the light every time she moved. There was something deeply human in the way she stood there, one hand loosely gripping her jacket, the other brushing a strand of hair from her cheek as the breeze moved through. When our eyes met, it wasn't electric or dramatic. It was gentle, like two tired souls recognizing each other without words. She gave me a faint smile, the kind that's polite but guarded, and I found myself walking over before I had time to think. We started with small talk, the kind that fills space but doesn't yet carry weight. She told me she came here often after work, just to breathe, to get away from the noise of everything else. I told her I came to clear my head too, though, truthfully, I didn't know what I was clearing it of anymore. As the conversation slowly unfolded, I realized she had a way of speaking that made time blur. Every sentence carried both warmth and distance, like she wanted to share, but only in pieces. Her laughter, when it came, was soft and unsteady, like it had been hiding for a while. We sat down on a bench near the pond, watching the water shift with the fading light. She told me she used to paint, but hadn't picked up a brush in years. When I asked why, she looked down at her hands, delicate but strong, and said quietly, "Life doesn't always leave room for art." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't. And somehow, that silence felt like the most honest response I could give. After a while, she stood up to leave. I thought that would be it, a brief, passing moment between two strangers who would forget each other by tomorrow. But before walking away, she hesitated. Then, almost without warning, she stepped closer and placed her hand lightly against my arm. It wasn't a long touch, just a moment, enough for me to feel the tremor in her fingers, the unspoken plea behind it. And before I could react, she pulled me close, her head resting briefly against my chest. It was so sudden, so fragile, that I didn't even breathe. When she let go, her eyes held a quiet storm, a mix of apology, fear, and something that looked a lot like longing. And then she said softly, almost to herself, "Sorry. I just needed to remember what steady feels like." That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be simple. I told myself I wouldn't go back. That what happened that evening, the way she held on, the way her breath trembled against my chest, was just a fleeting moment between two lonely people crossing paths at the wrong time. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something in that embrace that stayed with me, something that didn't feel finished. So 2 days later, I found myself walking toward that same park again, convincing myself I was only there for the fresh air. The sky was brighter this time, the kind of pale blue that makes everything seem softer. I didn't expect to see her, but there she was sitting on the same bench by the pond, sketchbook resting on her lap, eyes lost somewhere beyond the horizon. For a moment, I just watched her. She looked peaceful, but there was a kind of stillness in her that didn't belong to peace, more like quiet exhaustion. When she noticed me, her expression changed, not in surprise, but something gentler. Recognition, maybe even relief. "You came back," she said, her voice low but steady. I shrugged. Guess I needed some fresh air again. Her lips curved into that same faint, guarded smile. Seems like we both use that excuse. We talked like before, slowly, without rush or agenda. She asked me about my work, my family, my dreams, though she never talked much about herself. Every time I tried to turn the questions around, she deflected with humor or silence. It wasn't avoidance, not exactly. It was like she was protecting something fragile. The sun shifted higher, warm light spilling across her face. I noticed the small details I hadn't before. The way her eyes softened when she listened, the tiny freckles at the edge of her nose, the silver ring on her index finger that she kept twisting when she got lost in thought. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You're very easy to talk to. You don't try to fix things." "I don't think everything needs fixing," I replied. She smiled again, slower this time, like she was testing the weight of the words. "Maybe that's what scares me," she said quietly. "Someone who listens without trying to fix." We sat there for hours. The world moved around us. Joggers, children, the sound of distant laughter. But inside that small bubble of stillness, it felt like time had bent. Every glance carried something unspoken. Every pause hummed with quiet tension neither of us wanted to disturb. When she finally stood up to leave, I expected the same polite goodbye. But instead, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Maybe next time, you can bring a story." "A story?" I asked, smiling. She nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Something you haven't told anyone yet." And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume, the warmth of her words, and the ache of knowing there would definitely be a next time. The next time we met, the air carried that quiet heaviness that comes when two people have started to care more than they mean to admit. The cafe was almost empty. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the wide glass windows, turning the air golden and warm. She sat by the corner, near the bookshelves, wearing a soft gray sweater that looked too big for her, sleeves pulled halfway over her hands. Her hair was tied loosely, strands falling around her face in a way that looked effortlessly beautiful. When I walked in, she looked up and smiled. Not the polite kind, but one that reached her eyes. That smile felt like an unspoken welcome, like she had been waiting. "You're late," she said softly. "I didn't realize we had a time," I replied. "You always do," she said, and then sipped her coffee, hiding a small grin behind the rim of her cup. It was easy between us now. Conversation flowing without force, silence feeling safe rather than awkward. She asked me about my week, and I told her about the small things, deadlines, errands, the feeling of missing something unnamed. She listened closely, her chin resting lightly on her hand, her eyes tracing my face as if she was memorizing details. When I asked about her art, she hesitated. "I haven't drawn much lately," she admitted. "I used to paint every day, but somewhere along the way, it started to hurt more than it healed." Her voice trembled just slightly on that last word. I wanted to ask why, who, or what had taken that joy from her, but she looked down, fingers tracing circles on the coffee cup. "It's strange," she continued. "Sometimes when you lose something, it keeps echoing inside you, long after you've stopped listening for it." I didn't know what to say, so instead, I reached out instinctively and touched her hand, just lightly, my fingers brushing against hers. She froze, eyes lifting to meet mine. For a second, neither of us moved. Her skin was warm, her pulse a quiet rhythm beneath my fingertips. She didn't pull away. The world outside blurred. The hum of the espresso machine, the soft jazz playing in the background, the sound of someone laughing near the counter. It all faded. What remained was the quiet thrum of connection, the awareness that something fragile and alive was forming in that small space between our hands. Then she smiled, not wide, but slow and trembling, like it came from a place she hadn't visited in a long time. "You really shouldn't look at people that way," she said softly. "What way?" I asked. "Like you're trying to see the parts they keep hidden." I wanted to tell her I wasn't trying. I already could. But before I could speak, she gently withdrew her hand, folding it in her lap. "Some things," she whispered, "aren't meant to be found yet." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, tender, full of questions neither of us could bear to ask. And in that silence, I realized I didn't just want to know her secret. I wanted to be the person she finally trusted enough to share it with. The next time I saw her, the air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if the world around us had started holding its breath. The cafe was quieter than usual, the sky outside tinted with that silver light that comes just before rain. She sat by the window again, sketchbook open this time, pencil moving in slow, thoughtful lines. When I walked in, She didn't look up immediately, but I noticed something new. Her hand trembled just slightly as she drew, and her expression carried a softness I hadn't seen before, like she was painting from memory, not imagination. When she finally looked up, her eyes caught mine and held them for a moment too long. "You came," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Of course," I replied, sliding into the chair across from her. "You told me to bring a story." She laughed quietly, closing the sketchbook. "Did you?" I nodded. "But I think you're the one who should go first this time." Her smile faded. She leaned back in her chair, gaze shifting toward the window. "You wouldn't want to hear mine," she murmured. "It's not a happy one." "Maybe not," I said softly, "but it's yours. That makes it worth hearing." Her eyes flicked back to me, searching for what I couldn't tell. For permission, maybe. For understanding. Then, slowly she spoke. "There was someone," she began, "a long time ago. He said he loved me, in all the ways that sound beautiful when you're young and reckless enough to believe them." She paused, fingers tracing the edge of the table. "But love isn't always lost in grand gestures. Sometimes it dies quietly, in half-spoken words, in the way two people stop looking at each other." One day I woke up, and there was no one left to listen. I didn't interrupt. I just watched the way her expression shifted, the faint tremor in her jaw, the glint in her eyes. She tried to blink away. "I stopped painting for years after that," she continued, "because every color reminded me of what I lost." Her voice cracked on that last word, and something inside me ached. Without thinking, I reached across the table and rested my hand over hers, not to comfort, but to be present, to let her know she wasn't alone in that moment. Her fingers tightened slightly around mine, just a small squeeze, barely there, but it felt like a confession. When she spoke again, her tone was quieter. "You shouldn't get too close to people like me," she said. "We carry storms we don't talk about." I met her gaze, steady and calm. "Maybe I don't mind a little rain." She looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for the catch, the warning, the reason to pull away. But instead of speaking, she just exhaled, her hand still resting in mine. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, streaking down the glass. Inside, her silence said everything her words couldn't. A fragile truth hovering between us, trembling but real. And though neither of us said it aloud, I knew something had shifted. The space between us had become something deeper, heavier, like the quiet before the storm finally breaks. The rain didn't stop that evening. It poured relentlessly, washing the city in silver, and the streets outside the cafe glistened like liquid glass. I offered to walk her home, half expecting her to refuse, half hoping she wouldn't. She hesitated, watching the water stream down the window, then gave a small nod. "If you don't mind getting a little wet," she said softly. We stepped out together beneath the narrow shelter of my umbrella. The sound of the rain was loud, steady, rhythmic, filling the space between our footsteps. The city around us seemed blurred, people rushing past under hoods and coats, headlights scattering light across puddles. But inside that small circle of fabric and closeness, it felt quiet, just the two of us moving through the world as if time had slowed down to watch. She walked close beside me, her hand occasionally brushing against my arm. Every touch felt deliberate, even when it wasn't. Her perfume mixed with the scent of rain and wet earth. Clean, nostalgic, something achingly human. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt unnecessary, like speaking would break whatever fragile spell the night had cast. Halfway to her apartment, the wind shifted and the umbrella flipped inside out with a sudden gust. We both laughed, a surprised, breathless kind of laughter, and ducked into the doorway of a closed bookstore to escape the rain. Drops glimmered in her hair, strands clinging to her cheeks, her sweater darkened from the damp. She looked effortlessly beautiful, not polished or composed, but real. She leaned against the wooden door, catching her breath. "You're drenched," she said, eyes soft with amusement. "So are you," I replied. Something about the way she looked at me then, the warmth, the weariness, the unguarded tenderness, made my chest tighten. There was no distance between us now. The rain echoed around the empty street, But inside that doorway, there was only quiet. Her eyes flicked to my lips for a heartbeat, then back to my face. "You shouldn't look at me like that," she whispered. "Like what?" "Like I'm someone worth waiting for." The words hit me like a pulse, deep and quiet. I stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her damp clothes, to hear the uneven rhythm of her breath. I didn't reach out, not yet. I just stood there, letting the silence fill with everything neither of us dared to say. Finally, she looked down, her voice trembling slightly. "You make it hard to stay hidden," she said. I swallowed hard. "Then don't hide." She closed her eyes for a moment, not to shut me out but to steady herself. When she opened them again, something inside her had softened. She reached out, fingers brushing my cheek, lingering there for a moment longer than she should have. The touch was light, trembling, like something both forbidden and necessary. And in that small, rain-soaked corner of the city, I realized she wasn't pulling me close because she wanted to be loved. She was doing it because she didn't remember what it felt like to be safe. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to remind her. It was late by the time we reached her apartment. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the streetlights glowed with that quiet gold that only appears after a storm. Everything felt slower, gentler, as if the night itself was catching its breath. She lived in an old brick building with ivy curling along the walls and small white curtains swaying behind narrow windows. When she unlocked the door, she paused, looking back at me like she wasn't sure what to do next. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "You should come in. You'll catch a cold." Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with jasmine and old books. A record player hummed quietly in the corner, playing something soft and slow, the kind of music that sounds like memory. She handed me a towel and disappeared for a moment, returning with 2 cups of tea. Her hair was still damp, falling in waves against her shoulders, her sweater replaced by a loose cream blouse that hung just off her collarbone. We sat on the couch, not touching, but close enough that the heat from her skin reached me. The rain tapped gently against the windows, a steady, soothing rhythm that filled the silence. "Do you ever wonder," she said finally, "why some people just show up in your life out of nowhere?" "Ich glänzte her." "All the time." She smiled faintly, looking down at her cup. "And sometimes they make you feel like maybe the parts of you that broke weren't meant to stay broken." Her voice wavered on that last word. Without thinking, I set my cup down and shifted closer. She didn't look up at first, just stared at the floor. And then, as if something inside her gave way, she leaned in. Slowly, carefully, she rested her head against my shoulder. I froze for a second, then let my arm come around her, holding her lightly. Her breath was uneven, not quite crying, but close. The warmth of her pressed against me, her hair brushing my neck, her fingers curling lightly against my sleeve. No words passed between us. There didn't need to be any. The silence was full of everything she couldn't say and everything I already understood. She pulled me closer, not urgently, but with a quiet desperation, like if she let go, she might lose something she couldn't afford to lose again. My hand slid to her back, tracing small circles through the thin fabric of her blouse. I could feel the rise and fall of her breath against my chest, quick at first, then slowing, steadying, sinking with mine. Time didn't just slow down, it stopped. The sound of the rain faded, the music drifted into the background, and all that existed was this. Her warmth, her trembling quiet, the ache of something beautiful and broken finding peace for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You make it feel like the world isn't as heavy." I wanted to tell her that she wasn't heavy, that she was the reason I'd learned what stillness could feel like. But instead, I just held her tighter, because sometimes words ruin what silence has already made perfect.